middle of the book of Exodus, which has, with this little part right in the middle of it, has in many ways the point of the whole book itself, which is the covenant at Sinai, which is going to be a major concern for the rest of the Bible, including the New Testament. The covenant's basic understanding of a relationship established between God and the people and the behavior expected of the people, they form the basis of everything that comes after, including undergirding the teachings of Jesus himself. Interesting side note, Old Testament and New Testament, that's perfectly acceptable to call them that, but they're also essentially the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Now, as many of you know, the mountain, the names are Sinai and Horeb. Same mountain, different names, and that has to do with different sources which Exodus and the rest of the Pentateuch derive. Some communities understood that mountain to be a place called Sinai, others understood it to be Horeb. It's the same place. Now, Hebrew narrative has a conventional way of beginning to tell a story, especially if it's a story within a larger story. It's not unlike the English convention of once upon a time. It starts a particular kind of story, and we know what kind of story that's going to be. In Hebrew, well, the English translation is something like, in your English Bibles, it'll be something like, and it was, or after this, or something like that. The incidents at Sinai Horeb at this point, when they officially land there in chapter 19, doesn't start that way, which is the biblical writer's way of saying, sit up, pay attention, wake up. Something new is about to happen. It's the only time in the whole Bible that a people have a direct experience of God. From here on out, the experience is going to be filtered through others. In the Hebrew Bible, it's going to be people like the prophets, on occasion, a decent king. And obviously, for the Pentateuch, it's going to be the figure of Moses. Now, for the second time in the book of Exodus, self-identification is necessary. The first one was at the bush with Moses alone. And that identification was to remind Moses, if he ever knew it, that this God had a relationship with Moses' own ancestors. But now we're at a different place. Now God has already acted. So when God self-introduces at Sinai, what God indicates is the action that has already taken place. God has demonstrated something about God by acting on behalf of this people against all odds, against Pharaoh, against the array of Egyptian gods, against taskmasters, against everybody. This God has managed to get slaves free. The first offer of the covenant is made. It's in Nuche here. It's only tiny, where God essentially says, I'm going to be your God if you'll be my people. And the people say yes, even without any other introduction, without any understanding of what might be expected of them. They say yes. This is a major movement for the people who were absolutely not going to go with the program at first, then reluctantly went with the program. And then every time there was a problem on the way, they complained about it. Well, now they're saying yes. So we're seeing some trust on their part. What they're going to get into is going to be not so much a rule keeping. I mean, it's going to look like it for a little while because we're going to very quickly get to the 10 words and then the covenant code, and that's followed by all kinds of other legislation. But at the beginning, this is really all about relationship. The rules, the legislation is important, but that's never the most important thing throughout this whole experience. What they're going to learn to be is what they've already been called, which is a holy nation, a treasure, and a kingdom of priests. What's going to happen for them is they're going to be commissioned to be people who embody God's own purposes on all the earth. Now, although Moses has been called to be a leader and mediator by God back at the bush, the people haven't yet accepted him completely. So we get another manifestation from God on this occasion of how important Moses and Moses' role will be, because they're allowed to overhear this conversation between God and Moses. Now, they're going to stay in this spot at the foot of Sinai Horeb for the rest of Exodus, all the way through Leviticus and into about a third of the book of Numbers. One of the things that happens here, and it's going to happen for a while, certainly in the book of Exodus, but it's going to happen again going forward, is that Moses is constantly in motion. He's up and down that mountain. In this chapter alone, he's up there and down from there about 6 times. And there are places in the text where we're not exactly sure where he is, because he's up to hear from God. He's back to give a message to the people. He's up midway at one point. Peripatetic, but all in the service of God and the people. Now, meeting God is obviously a rather extraordinary event. So preparations have to be made, and they're extensive. And on the one hand, seem a little silly, like washing their clothes and abstaining from sex. But the point of this is not that sex is bad or that it's never okay to have dusty clothes. They're out in the middle of nowhere, right? In a desert, so they're going to get dusty. It has to do with the beginnings of ritual purity, which is going to take on much more importance as we move later in the book of Exodus and over into Leviticus. One of the things you note along the way is the big biblical affection for numbers. So it's not just any day that this stuff happens. It's in the 3rd month after their release, on the 3rd day of the 3rd month, that this meeting with God happens. 3, as many of you know, is one of the numbers of completion. A part of their life is over. They're about to start something new. And then we've got all that business of making sure that boundaries are observed. It's dangerous, that mountain. It's already making noises and making movements that are not typical of mountains. And there's a lot of fire and smoke. So it looks frightening. God tells Moses, keep them back. They're not supposed to touch the mountain because, as we've seen a little bit before, it's dangerous to be too close to God because God, A, is utterly free. And the other thing is, being that close to the divine presence is absolutely overwhelming. It could annul human existence. I mean, this is a trivial comparison, but you know how we can't look directly at the sun for any length of time because our retinas get destroyed. People trying to make sense of this encounter reflect on things like that. Martin Buber says it's absolutely inexpressible. There's no way we can talk about in our words, in human words, what the experience of being in the presence of a living God is like. I mean, other places in the Bible, when people try to talk about that, they say things like Ezekiel, the 1st chapter. He talks about he had a vision of the living God, and he can't tell you what it was. And there are people, I've had a tiny one of these, and many people have had experiences which feel like an experience of God, and there's no way I can talk about it. I mean, I can talk around it. I can't talk directly about it. Anyway, and there's also that ancient belief that if you see God, you die. You can't live and see God. Now, obviously, special exceptions are going to be made for Moses, who does see God on a couple of occasions. And for the elders, in chapter 24, we're going to have a brief glimpse. And then there are all those pyrotechnics. Lots of fire, lots of smoke, recalling the fire at the bush, the pillar of fire by night, the pillar of smoke by day. And just a small thing. We've been talking about, and I explained to you a bit about that first word, which is translated in our Bibles as Lord and written that way, capital O-R-D, but the O-R-D are smaller font. Every time you see that, it's translating this name, the name that Moses got at the bush. It is the special name of Israel's God. Then there's the more generic word God. And I'm doing this now because we're going to see this in this beginning, in this chapter. God will say, I am the Lord your God. So Lord is my designation because of my special relationship to you. Think of using, this is again pedestrian, but think of using first names for people you know really well or their nicknames. And you don't do that with people who are at a distance. So this is God's special name for the Israelites. God is the more generic. Now I'm Adonai, your God. The other thing about the word God, which is pronounced Elohim, and then there are variants of it, El and Eloah, is a plural. Elohim, the ending im always means, or almost always means a plural in English. So it can mean either God, no, it can mean God with a big G, it can mean God with a little g, or it can mean God's. And when we get to chapter 24, and you've already been there, there are a couple of places when it talks about God's little g, it's the same word. And we have to then try to figure out what they're talking about there. That yes, there were other gods at this point. Adonai, in these narratives, does not say there are no other gods but me. What God is saying, what Adonai, Lord, is saying is, but I'm your God. I'm the most powerful God, as a matter of fact. We get to the one true God, the God that Muslims and Christians and Jews now celebrate, much later in the biblical text. It won't appear until the book of Isaiah.